I appreciate everybody sitting here and listening through some stuff. I want to give Greg plenty of time because I know he can be long-winded.
Amen.
So the next little presentation that we'll go through is recovery language. It would be naive of us to not address the elephant in the room when you're working with these folks when it comes to the stigma that's kind of attached to people with a substance use issue. That's part of the reason why we're in the state that we're in as a country when it comes to the drug epidemic that's going on in America today, is because the enormous stigma that's attached to people who are suffering from a substance use issue. So what we want to try to do is use language that's going to empower them, destigmatize, and kind of unify us and them in ways that can practically lend themselves to opportunities, not just for the individual that you're with, but like for the next person. Because the way that you talk about someone behind their back or, even to their face makes a big difference in whether you restore or respect the dignity that God has given them inherently as a person that He created. Greg had to sit through this last week, so I'll try to change it up a little bit. But I did add the 3 E's, which is going to teach you a little bit about how to win an argument, if you need to, about somebody with a substance use issue. Because you're here because you're advocating for this population. You care enough to give a Saturday morning and potentially a lot more time to try to serve a group of people who are very probably misunderstood and oppressed. About 92 people in America die from a substance use related overdose every day. Now, about 240 die from alcohol related issues. There's almost 3 times more alcohol related deaths. But if a terrorist stood on top of a building at Wright State University and shot 350 people, or 330 actually it would be, in one day, and they took credit for it as like a nation or a terrorist group, this country would go to war immediately to try to defend those lives and to give the inherent dignity to those that they lost that would be, justified. However, that's how many people are dying of a substance use related issue in our country every day, and there's probably a lot more than that, honestly. And yet Satan has convinced those in the general public and those who don't have somebody who's a loved one in the substance use world, Satan has convinced us that they're getting what they deserve. That's 65,000 people that died in 2017, or roughly. So I'll come back to that. If 65,000 people passed away in a year, that, just for perspective, the Afghanistan war, I think in American lives, cost a total of 5,000 or less. And we couldn't move on from that fast enough, and yet we aren't even picking up the tools and the weapons to fight this battle the way that we should. Other than you guys, which, to your credit, you're trying to do that today. So this is the worst number in the history of our country, 65,000 deaths. Since 1972, when Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, we've spent $1 trillion. 1T, capital T, $1 trillion. And the overdose rate was 6,500 in 1972. It was 65,000 plus last year. So in 45 years and $1 trillion later, the problem has gotten somewhere around 10 times worse than it was. So the typical MO, or the status quo for how to intercede for this population, has obviously not worked. What I'm here to tell you is, the good news is that when folks like yourself step into this arena and you make a choice to advocate for this population, you hold the cards as to whether they're going to holistically be changed, how they're viewed and how they're treated in America. The church is probably the least utilized resource in the fight against substance use in America today, with some of the most resources. We were supposed to have been, and up until recent times, I think, have been the greatest social service provider network in the history of the world. But we sit in a country that essentially our government has done it for us, and then we complain about it when they do it poorly. So we have the opportunity to enter into the service of trying to affect these individuals, and how you use your words in consideration of these folks matters a lot. 63% of Americans have been directly affected, so a family member or a loved one has been affected themselves by addiction. 67% believe there's a stigma attached, and 74% believe policies and practices should change. That came from training from Faces and Voices of Recovery. If 74% of everybody in America believe that practices and policies should change, why haven't they changed yet? If we can attach more value to the folks that we're trying to serve, that will make all the difference, I hope. So in order to properly understand who we are helping, it might be necessary to understand their language and the language that we use to refer to them. The recovery and substance use population has a lot of unique language that is its own, and a lot of it that is the way that they refer to themselves, but that kind of perpetuates a stigma against people in substance use or in recovery. So what are some of the words, apart from alcoholic and addict, what are some of the words or thoughts or feelings that you get when you hear the word addict? What do you think of?
People use the term junkie.
Junkie. Yep. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I promise.
I think the feeling hopeless.
Hopeless? Uh-huh.
I don't personally think this, but I have a family member, they call him low life.
Low life, criminal,
Criminal.
Manipulative.
manipulative. What? Hopeless? Thief, probably. That'd be one. So there are a lot of terms that have been attached to people with a substance use issue. Does everybody heard about Demi Lovato overdose a couple weeks ago? You wouldn't have to search very hard to find some of what people said about her after that. And I would challenge everybody, because like Prince and Michael Jackson and to an extent Robin Williams, they all died of substance use related disorders recently, and nobody made fun of them as much as they did somebody who survived, which was interesting to me, the difference in the public eye or the public arena. But like, there's a lot of terms that we use that can be potentially hazardous. There was a show coming out, said to come out on Viceland, which I don't even know, is that a channel on cable or Vice, whatever, that they were going to title American Junkie. And they were trying to give a realistic view of what it looks like to be a substance user in America today. If they in any way cared about that population apart from their own ratings and money, that would not be the case, right? So alcoholics, similarly, we picture what we picture, which the photo to me is the one with the two parents in the front seat who are overdosed and the kid in the back seat in the car seat, which most of you have probably seen. When you say the word addict, that's what I picture, because that's what's been given to us, as essentially this is what it looks like. Time Magazine, did anybody see the Time Magazine article where they took advantage of a bunch of people in Miamisburg and Dayton? So they essentially took pictures of people who were in active overdose and then published that in their magazine. And people consented to that being published because they thought they were making a difference. Well, what really happened was they were being exploited, because Time Magazine profited handsomely to take pictures of people in overdose. And I'm here to tell you that telling people how bad a problem is doesn't make it better. It doesn't solve anything. So these are some of the words that I came up with: addict, alcoholic, drug abuse, substance use, junkie, felon, criminal, relapse, addiction as a disease. We'll get to that later. Crackhead, pothead, lowlife, tweaker, fiend, stoner, druggie. I've been called a few of these. There were times where I was happy to be called some of these. But these are things that we don't want to attach to the person because it removes their dignity, but it also prevents them from receiving the opportunities that they should tomorrow. Because essentially what we've done to try to treat a substance use issue in our country is put people in prison, give them the tag of being a felon, from which they can't usually rent housing, they can't usually get jobs very easily, not any that would help you to work in a free market that's going to add value and meaning to your life. And, you know, it can prevent them from having a lot of other opportunities too. So, how we relate to these folks matters a lot, and our language matters. Does anybody work in the medical field? Good. A lot of medical coding and things like that have kind of encouraged us to use language in talking about our patients, you know, that may be different from what you would typically use to their face, right? That type of language kind of becomes like a label. And it's not anything against the medical field, that's just kind of how it works. You're in a rush, you know, you use things that are a label. We want to try to get away from that because a person is a person first. And then we want to move more into, okay, what adds value to them? What is it about them that is unique? And really, you know, inherently, God created that individual. Who here has kids? You know your kids are sinners, right? That's not news to anyone? But you love them unconditionally anyway, right? Even when they're being a sinner. You know, sometimes that unconditional love is the way that God sees us. And so for us to start to degrade and kind of put our own labels on an individual just because they have a substance use issue, kind of, you know, you're removing the fatherhood a little bit, you know, because God authored that individual to be who they are, and they may have, you know, fallen into sin or apart from His mercy, but, you know, we want to try to restore some of that dignity to them. Don Coyes, who's in recovery himself, said words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. So this is as simple as I can make it. Don't call somebody by their worst behavior. Is anybody in recovery? So we all have bad behavior. A lot of times this person's substance use was based on a choice, but more than likely it was a choice they made when they were an adolescent. So if they've been the victim of trauma, abuse, neglect, or mental health issues that they've suffered from, when you're 12 years old and you get high and your anxiety goes away, that makes sense. You don't even know you have anxiety, but you feel better. And so that may be a choice that they made, yes, but that choice is largely based on something that happened when they were 12. Now, I'm not asking for volunteers, but I'd imagine that y'all made some bad choices when you were 12, right? There are inherently bad decisions that come out of an individual when they're in that adolescent stage of life. And so if you want to judge somebody and say that this is a choice, you can. But it's a choice they made when they were 12, right? There are lots of bad decisions people make when they're 12. And so let's not use that as the premise to oppress a portion of our population. 23.5 million people report to be in recovery in America today. More than 20 million meet criteria for a substance use disorder, apart from that 23.5. So we're talking about 44 or more million people in our country who are either in active substance use or are in recovery. That's 25% probably of the adults. So it's absurd that our primary treatment for addiction is to lock people up when it is currently 25% of the adult populace. That hasn't worked. To the tune of 97% of people will relapse immediately following their incarceration. Whereas if they enter into good treatment, they have like a between 15 and 70% chance of maintaining long-term recovery, depending on the type of treatment. It costs $32,000 to incarcerate someone in Ohio for a year. Greg, did you give me that stat? I need a citation on that. Yes.
What are the reasons, like, I'm trying to understand, what are the reasons somebody that has a drug addiction someone be incarcerated? Like,
Possession,
oh,
among others. Tim's the expert there. OBIs, yeah. So, to my knowledge, it's the only medical issue that you can be incarcerated for having symptoms of it. Like, they don't pull you over for driving while diabetic. But, they can actually nowadays. You can get an OBI for that too. P.S. But, for the most part, as far as I know, this is the only medical issue, which we've been calling it since 1956. It's the only medical issue that you can be incarcerated for having.
So when they legalize marijuana in Ohio, they're gonna start pulling everybody over there trying to.
They already have. They already have. I receive clients almost weekly that have OVI under the influence of cannabis. And there's no acute intoxication test for cannabis, so your levels are going to maintain throughout the course of your life if you smoke it consistently. So, yeah, you're subject to a lot of potential legal issues, which I try to tell my clients all the time. But, whatever. So, don't refer to someone by their worst behavior. It's that simple. If you call someone an addict, can you imagine somebody calling you by your worst behavior? Booger eater, Netflix, binge watcher, smoker, donut, I don't know, whatever you want to say. Nobody refers to you that way. Thank God. Thank God. But when we call someone an addict or a junkie, we're essentially referring to them by their worst behavior for the rest of their life. And that is not the lead. It shouldn't even be the footnote on that person's life. But yet that's how we choose to refer to them. And so no wonder Satan has taught us that this is a population who doesn't deserve grace, who we can allow to die to the tune of 65,000 people a year, and essentially say, well, they made a choice. Okay? We all make bad choices. Let's try to give a little bit of what has been given to us, which is mercy. Okay, so there's something by Rogers called unconditional positive regard. This doesn't mean that you give somebody money unconditionally or that you let them stay in your basement unconditionally, but it does mean that you treat them with positive regard unconditionally, which is essentially what God has done to us. The same way that you look at your kids, right? You want what's best for them. Sometimes that means you need to correct them, yes, but that doesn't mean that you regard them any less because of that need for correction. So here are some ways that you might ask some questions that are framed a little bit differently than probably than the way that these people have been questioned by most other authorities in their life. Which, by the way, the authority power dynamic will be there. When they enter into this house, even though you're a volunteer, you still have the implicit authority. So, that may lead them to mistrust you a bit, honestly, to begin with, at least. So just be aware, Whitney and Brandy will be there along with many other folks to help that kind of guard get let down and things like that over time. But here's some ways, understanding that they've been through trauma, more than likely, and even if it wasn't because, or the onset of their substance use type trauma, but more after they entered into the substance use world, if they're coming into the house with withdrawal, they've had trauma because they've been around people who have been in some pretty dark, difficult situations. They may have seen people die and overdose in front of them, and they may never tell you that, but that's probably where they're coming from. So here's some questions that might be a little bit more attuned to giving them dignity and respect in your demeanor towards them. What are you willing to do right now? When will you be ready? How would your life be better if you were able to maintain recovery? Ask them, what could you do in a year if you were able to maintain your recovery? Notice I didn't say stay clean. I guess I should cover that. People aren't dirty just because they use drugs. I know a lot of really, really neat and tidy people that use drugs. I have a 65-year-old client who was cut off of her medication because she took too many, who's, very clean. So, just because they use drugs doesn't make them dirty. We don't want to imply that. Your urine screens are not clean and dirty. They're positive and negative. So, how would you like to be better if you were able to maintain your recovery? What brought you here? What brought you to this point? It's not what did you do, that type of stuff. What can we do to help you today? Okay, so this is the way that Faces and Voices of Recovery has taught many in the recovery movement to refer to themselves. Not as a recovering addict or recovering alcoholic, but a person in long-term recovery. We covered what it looked like and what it meant to us to be an addict or an alcoholic. Part of what people refer to themselves as an addict and an alcoholic because they go to 12-step meetings, where they're taught to say, my name's Casey and I'm an alcoholic. Well, that's okay when they're sort of giving a nod to the fact that it's a chronic disorder and that if I went back to drinking tomorrow, that it wouldn't be cured, nor would I be able to moderate. But when you're speaking in public, that should not be the way that you refer to yourself. If you're talking to an individual who came into the house and they say, I'm a recovering addict, you say something like, I would choose to refer to you this way, and here's why. As a person seeking recovery, because I think that gives more dignity to you. Is that okay? That type of thing. So a person in long-term recovery is a person that there's an implied stability attached to. Because even a person in recovery, when they refer to themselves that way, the implication is, or the stigma against that is, they're going to relapse tomorrow. So you want to attach something that says, like, either I'm seeking long-term recovery or I'm in long-term recovery because that means something different. And when I say I'm a person in long-term recovery, I define it, which for me means that I haven't used drugs or alcohol for over 12 years. And here's what's happened since then. I became a believer, a husband, a dad, a counselor, missionary. So you give relatable evidence after you say what your recovery status is. You give relatable bullet points as to what that means for you. Because if we all sat here and tried to define recovery, you would come up with 15 different definitions. So you're going to define it for them, or they're going to define it for themselves. I'm a person in recovery, which for me means I haven't used drugs or alcohol for this long, and this is what's happening. That changes the story, because when I can say I'm a dad outside of my recovery status, everybody knows what that looks like. And that's something that the general public will be willing to support. Because they know, like, oh, my dad wasn't there. I could use that. I could have used that. I wish somebody, Or, my dad was there, and I know what that's like. Like, everybody deserves a dad. So those are the types of bullet points that the individual can give that will give the general public the ability to support recovery. Because if you say recovery to the average taxpayer that doesn't have a loved one in the population, they have no idea. So you want to give it to them. So recovery is unique, personal, and should be defined personally by the individual. So if they're on Suboxone, guess what? They can call themselves in recovery if that's how they feel about their Suboxone use. It's not up to you. If they're on medication for depression or anxiety, you should support that. I recently heard this from somebody who went to his Hope Teen Challenge, and I hope that it's wrong. But somebody was denied their medication when they went into that facility for psychiatric needs, who had just had trauma and abuse and neglect. They were raped several times. If you think that it's appropriate for you to deny someone medication who's had recent abuse and trauma, or any abuse and trauma, you're out of your mind. You're out of your mind. It's not up to us. It's up to the individual. And if that's the only thing that's keeping them from stabbing you, You want them to take it. You won't be stabbed in her story. So, let them define what their recovery status is and let them define it. This is about their empowerment, their strengths-based empowerment. So let them find their strength. You can help reflect it to them and then help them identify as a person in recovery and identify what that means to them. If it means they go to AA for the rest of their life and they say, I'm a happy recovering alcoholic, okay. People still come to know the Lord there, it's okay. Let them do it. My name's Casey, and I'm a person in long-term recovery or seeking it. What do you think the definition of long-term recovery is, time-wise? Forever? It could be. Hopefully it is. Most people usually come up with a year. But if you're abstinent from heroin for 6 days, that's a long time. So let the individual say, if they want to define themselves as being in long-term recovery, if they got 6 weeks, go for it. Most people with a substance use disorder cannot make it 6 weeks. So if you want to define yourself as being in long-term recovery, go for it. And usually, like I said, you add some credence or some, extras as to what that means. So if you are not necessarily feeling comfortable with the term long-term recovery, you can say, I want to say you're a person seeking long-term recovery, which is kind of just giving them a little bit more, you're giving them a little stability, just in the language you're using about them. And as they refer to themselves in that fashion, now they can go into AA and NA and refer to themselves as an addict or an alcoholic if that's what they choose to do. But if they're speaking on behalf of the recovery community, trust me, I want them to say something different because I don't want to be in this position 10 years from now where, the primary treatment for people with substance use issues is still the criminal justice system. So let's try to encourage them by the language that you use about them and to them. And that includes when you're talking to each other, right? You don't want to use terms that are in any way depraving the individual of that dignity when you're referring to them outside. So, words to avoid. Addiction as a disease is listed first. I believe addiction is a disease, but I also don't care what you call it. So this is where the 3 E's come in, which is not a part of the packet that I gave you, but I will cycle back to the 3 E's for a second. So what I want you to do when you're talking or defending our folks, our substance use population, is use 3 sentences, essentially, to give your elevator speech. You want to lead with empathy for your audience, not for the individual you're defending. So lead with empathy for your audience. Where did they come to their understanding of drug addiction? Where did they come to their understanding of the people that you're trying to serve? Because, believe it or not, when you step back in your churches and everything, you might be the most educated person about addiction, out of 100. So what are you going to say? How are you going to approach people when they ask, what are you doing at her story? Here's how because people may say it's sin or it's a choice. When it's the best idea for an individual to use drugs because their mom shot them up when they're 11 years old with meth, I don't know if I would call that sin. Because if you're 11 years old and your mom gives you something, I don't know, how you want to quantify that. You can call it whatever you want, but that person made the best choice for themselves in their context. So that's why we want to lead with empathy for your audience. So if somebody from your church says, why do you want to help those people anyway? You could say, it's a tough population. So you're showing empathy for their position. You can say, but a lot of people get better. There's like 24 million people in recovery in America. So you're educated. And then exhortation. You're like, You don't have to join us, but if you want to know how, come with me. I'll help you. So empathy for your audience. Educate your audience gently. And then exhort them. Come with them to something. Don't tell them what to do. Ask them to come with you, because that's what you're already doing. So, if you see people who say addiction is or isn't a disease on Facebook, you see 174 comments that are all not helpful. It doesn't matter if you win that argument. There is not a person that gets their mind changed because of what you wrote on Facebook. So I don't care what you call it. Let's just agree it needs to change and come with me. You know, that's empathy, education, exhortation. It's easy, it's simple, and you don't have to win. You win by losing, kind of, or you win by surrendering and just saying, I'm not the expert here, but, I know a way we can help. I know a way that we can change this thing. And those are the types of ways that you can kind of win an argument, because nobody's going to want to be the person who says, well, I don't want it to change. Even if they're just a taxpayer, they want it to change, because it costs $32,000 to put somebody in jail or prison in Ohio, and it costs a lot less to put them in Christopher House, which is an inpatient treatment center, and their chances are between 5 and 35 times greater that they're going to maintain their recovery coming out of treatment than incarceration. So even if you're just a person who's interested in saving money, it still makes sense to support recovery. Narcan costs the state $18 a piece. Do you know how much it costs to put someone through the coroner's office? More than $18, okay? Like, you can Narcan somebody 100 times, and you will save the state millions of dollars in entitlement benefits, future therapy, future substance abuse counseling, and all those things that are going to be necessary for that person's family after they die of an overdose. So some guy in Butler County can say, my police aren't going to carry Narcan, so I'm going to let the state spend $1 million to try to support this family because I can save 18 up front. Are you out of your mind? A tox screen at the coroner costs 10 times more than that $18 to give Narcan in the first place. Don't be naive and ignorant about what it is that we're truly supporting here, because I see the clients that come in when they don't even have a dad because he died of an overdose. And that's costing the state a lot of money over here. If they're not incarcerated, you're paying for their treatment. So you have a choice. You want to pay for something that works or for something that doesn't. Because right now, you've spent $1 trillion over the last 45 years to pay for something that doesn't work. So it's time to try something different. Sorry, I get off sometimes. So you don't want to talk about medically assisted treatment to somebody who doesn't understand it, because they don't understand it and they don't have to. Say it's a pathway that people get better. I don't know what the statistics are. I do, but you won't, probably. I don't know what the statistics are, but it's better than nothing. And just leave it. You don't have to explain every little bit of the process. Everything. You wouldn't call somebody schizophrenic. Maybe you would, but try not to. Bipolar. You don't want to demonstrate or kind of out them as a member of AA or NA, because that's an anonymous fellowship and it's supposed to stay anonymous. Here's some things to support. Person in long-term recovery, person seeking long-term recovery, person who needs recovery. I don't call anyone an active, so I'm definitely not going to call them an addict, but I don't even use the word addiction when I'm speaking in public about people. Because just because you added ION on the end doesn't mean that the stigma didn't get attached to the person when you talk about their addiction. Say they're in active substance use, because that's what they are. It's not up to you to call them whether they've got an addiction or not. That's not your job. And by the way, in the DSM, it's called a substance use disorder. So it doesn't say they're in addiction there either. So don't, you're not a doctor, don't. Maybe some of you are, but still, Let's stay away from that terminology. So people who suffer from or have symptoms of schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. We want to use language that empowers people and uplifts their value. That's essentially all we're doing here, is trying to understand how do we add value to the person. And that is relatively simple in the way that we refer to them, in the way that we can, just identify them differently. You will be counterculture if you use different language pertaining to this population. But when you can add value and dignity to the individual, that changes how they view themselves. That changes how you view them when you refer to them differently. And, they'll come into your relationship with you with some bias in some ways that they refer to themselves that may be counterproductive. So you can, if they come in and they say, I'm just an addict, you can say, I'm going to choose to call you a person seeking long-term recovery. And I hope you join me in that. If you don't, that's okay, but I think it gives you more dignity. That's really as simple as it gets. Any questions? Criticism? I'm open to that too. I really appreciate the sacrifice you guys are making to try to enter into this. I know how difficult it can be, and I know that it takes a lot. And probably you guys have some personal things going on that maybe have brought you to this point. So thanks for spending your time with these folks. You'll love them just like I do, because I think when you get at the same table with them, you'll see it's much, much harder to objectify somebody when you shake their hand first, kind of. And that's like a good exchange. And if the church and the person with the substance use issue can get at the same table, this addiction thing in America will go away overnight if we all just sat and had dinner together, honestly. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.